If you don't want to overheat, get stranded, and blow up your engine on a hot summer day, check out this video. And if you're into my classic car content, download my newsletter below, and I'm going to give you steady, complimentary tips every week. I know almost everyone knows this trick, but it's so fundamental, I had to start with it first. So let's go. Coolant. Having a good coolant in your engine, having coolant in your engine at all, is highly advisable. So often cooling problems are caused by obviously being too low on coolant, or by a radiator that's got clogged fins, or a cooling system that's got corrosion. So having a good fresh coolant is very important. Having it topped off to the proper level surely is important as well. So when I talk about a good coolant, you either need a good brand, something like Xerox, Prestone. Honestly, even something like the local O'Reilly 50/50 mix is totally sufficient. I want to see good coolant, but more so when I'm saying good coolant, I want to see a good coolant mix. In other words, have good, clean, fresh coolant in there. Make sure it's not all broken down, okay? Additionally, if you're a racer, you might say, hey, I just run straight up water, and there's a lot of evidence that says water actually cools very well by itself. But I wouldn't recommend you run just water, because water is very corrosive and doesn't have any of the antifreeze properties or any of the lubricating protective properties that you get with a traditional antifreeze. If you're gonna run just water, or you don't wanna run antifreeze, I don't know if you've ever seen this stuff, it's called water wetter. Water wetter is amazing because it literally wets the water, which means it adheres to the metal components of the engine, like the block and the radiator. So what it does is it allows the heat to dissipate from the block to the water faster, and then from the water to the radiator and off into the air faster. So it literally wets the water. Adding water wetter to your system can make about a 5 to 10 degree difference, and works great just with water. Also, in case you didn't know, you can add it in with coolant and it'll work as well. One of the reasons to use it obviously is temp, but number two is also because it's going to be lubricating and protecting. Another mistake you want to make sure you don't make is becoming victim to electrolysis. That's one of the reasons why coolant, water wetter, or some other radiator fluid is going to be beneficial. You don't want to have that corrosion. You don't want to have your radiator die prematurely. So what happens is you get electrolysis is an electrical ground, like voltage going through your actual cooling system. So what you want to do is make sure that if you've got a car that has like rubber radiator mounts, or it's in a plastic housing, make sure that you ground your radiator. I always like to run a ground strap from my radiator to the body of the car to make sure that when I pop the cap over time, I don't get all that corrosion and that electrolysis, so don't let that happen to you. So electrolysis is very preventable. Make sure that you're in the know and you ground your radiator and you have proper fluid in there to make sure that you're not going to get premature radiator failure. And before shutting the door on electrolysis, one more thing to note. I've had a lot of radiators come through my shop that have failed, and I found in talking to Griffin Radiator and Northern Radiator and some of the other suppliers that they actually have a weird problem that they see, and it's specific to where I live and specific to another area. So Northern California and actually Northern Carolina have really hard water, and as such they literally recommend that you don't use that water in your radiator. So if you can, and you're in those environments, or really in any environment, I recommend coolant and distilled water, obviously water wetter or something, and distilled water, or just get a 50/50 ready mix that's already pre-diluted, so you make sure not to put corrosive water in your radiator. Another mistake people make all the time is not having the proper radiator cap. A lot of these fancy radiators come with a pretty cool billet cap. Most radiators come with whatever radiator cap you used to have on the car, right, when you replaced it. And I don't know that people really understand how important a radiator cap is. I look for two things in a radiator cap. One, I'm a fan of a lever vent cap because it allows me to release the pressure when I open the radiator, so I can make sure I'm not going to get steam blowing off and on me. You can kind of purge the system just by popping that. Also, I like it because when I tighten it down, I know that I'm locked in place. The other thing that's important about the radiator cap, and it should be listed on almost every radiator cap, is the pound rating. So what's important about the poundage rating of a radiator cap is you have to look at a radiator like it's its own internal environment. So if you change from like a 13-pound cap to a 17-pound cap, you're actually raising the boiling point of the water. Raising the boiling point of the water obviously means it's going to boil later, but what it does is it takes hot pockets that are in your cylinder heads or in your manifold or in your block, and it makes that not become a boiling spot, so you get better circulatory flow. So understanding that you can run a higher pressure cap to affect the ecosystem is a huge tip to know, but don't go too high. If you've got an old heater core, bad hoses, worn out clamps, you could create a leak. So if you're going to go with a nice cap, make sure that you've got nice clamps, your hoses and everything are in great condition. Next off, another simple one, but people seem to mix these things up all the time, is a thermostat. I always like to put a new thermostat in almost every car when I buy it so that I know what I'm working with. It's usually located on your upper radiator hose. It's pretty easy to access. And the importance of the thermostat is this. One, if you can get a fail-safe thermostat, if it ever fails, it'll fail in the open position, still allowing water to flow through the engine. Two, I like to run the right temperature thermostat for the driving and the climate that I'm in. So for example, I'm in Sacramento and it's generally very hot here. So I like to use a 160-degree thermostat. A lot of people prefer like a 180 or a 195, but these classic cars aren't trying to run hot in order to burn emissions cleaner and pass smog. So I want to start as low as I can. Picture like a fighter. Do you want to start out back in the corner of the ring, or do you want to come out to the center of the ring and fight the overheating, right? So if you're at 160, you're on early and you're circulating. If you're at 180, it's going to get hot, then it comes on, and then it starts to cool you down. So I prefer a 160 thermostat, and I think you'll find that that probably works well for you as well. Some people are going to argue with this point, and that is, what if I want to run no thermostat? I've literally never found a situation where running no thermostat and just leaving the water neck open and clear has ever helped. The water's actually not going through there at the right rate of speed. If you're gonna run no thermostat, you can try your luck at what's called a restrictor plate. So companies like Moroso make these in various colors, which denote various diameter of holes, and what that's gonna do is it's gonna slow down the flow of water to try to keep it in the radiator a little bit longer to let the fans cool it a little more effectively. This is kind of trial by error, so if you want to try a restrictor plate and you're fighting some weird issues, you might do it. I know a lot of racer guys that do it, but again, I strongly recommend you run a thermostat. Since we were just talking about people making the mistake of no thermostat or the mistake of trying to run restrictor plates, what they're trying to do a lot of times when they do that is increase speed of the water passing through the cooling system. So don't underestimate how important like a good quality high flow water pump might be, because it's all about keeping that water moving through the cooling system. So if you can get a high flow water pump, depending on what kind of car you have, you might also consider like either a smaller pulley to make it spin faster, or you could change your crank pulley to alter those ratios. That's another way that you can try to get more water flow through your system to try to help it stay cooler. So following up on the water pump, a huge mistake people make all the time, and they don't realize that they're doing it, is they have belt issues. So we're talking about spinning that pulley, spinning that water pump. That's all well and good, but if your belts are too loose or your belts are worn and slipping, guess what? You're gonna get some slippage, and that belt's not spinning properly and turning the pulley at the right rate of speed. So always make sure that you've got good quality belts. I always like to run with something that's ribbed on the bottom as just a traditional smooth belt on both sides. It's gonna get a lot more purchase on the pulley. In some instances, you can run 2 pulleys like you can on this AC, or for example, this water pump was originally designed to have 2 pulleys on it, except for it can't because the power steering won't accommodate. But the more purchase, the more bite, the more grab onto that pulley, the better it's gonna spin. So make sure that you've got belts that are in good condition, and especially if you're running a mechanical fan or a mechanical water pump, that belt is so important. Check it for cracks, fraying, any signs of wear and tear, because if you lose that belt, if that belt breaks, water pump's not spinning, fan's not spinning, temp's going through the roof, and you're stuck on the side of the road. So I don't know about you, I don't want to be stuck on the side of the road with an overheated car. At best, I'm overheated and pissed off. At worst, you could blow the motor, crack the block, blow a head gasket, do irreparable major damage to your engine. So just pay attention to make sure that your cooling system's working properly. In fact, if you don't know, maybe have a gauge. If you don't have a gauge, you can buy like an infrared light to try to check your cooling system's temp, or get a good gauge, because obviously trying to see if it's hot or running right isn't the best way to do it. Maybe you notice that it smells funny. Maybe you can tell that it's running hot because it's sluggish or it's starting to diesel. But just make sure you understand what temp your car is running at. It's a good basis for understanding how your car is going to be out in the heat, how reliable it might be, and kind of keep you protected from any major big issues with overheating. To that end, one of the biggest things literally is radiator size and style. This car has a nice huge radiator, which is highly beneficial, right? But the problem you have in so many cars is you don't have a lot of room for a big radiator. What I'm getting at is size does matter when it comes to radiators. The bigger the radiator, the more fluid capacity it's gonna have, and generally as a rule, the cooler it's gonna be able to dissipate heat. You've got traditional radiators that are gonna be brass and copper. They actually cool very well. Some people will not run an aluminum radiator because they feel that a brass radiator or copper radiator will actually cool a lot better. The problem with that is anymore, it's very hard to find those types of radiators. If you've got an all original car, you either need to try to get that radiator recored or rebuilt, or you buy an aftermarket radiator. And so many of the aftermarket replacement radiators are like plastic and aluminum combinations of the originals. So getting a new radiator actually sometimes can be a step backwards, which is super frustrating. You think I got a brand new radiator and I still overheat. So when you're looking at radiators, we're gonna wanna talk about size. One of the most important things about size is gonna be thickness. I'm sure you've heard of a 2-core radiator that has 2 rows. A 3-core has 3 rows of fins, or even a 4-core is usually a really thick radiator. So when you don't have room width-wise or height-wise for a wide, tall, large radiator, the more cores, the better. Again, we're gonna be able to flow more water, we're gonna have more water capacity, and we're just gonna have better overall cooling. But sometimes we don't have room this way, right? So in that case, we switch to something that might be a little bit thinner. But what's nice when you do that, a lot of times you would consider an aluminum radiator, because an aluminum radiator as a rule isn't really gonna be a 3 or a 4-core radiator. Like this radiator here is about 4 inches thick enough probably to be a traditional 4-core. But instead it actually only has 2 cores, but they're about twice as big as the traditional cores on a stock radiator. So they're wider, they flow a lot better, they don't corrode as easily, so they're just gonna generally offer better cooling. So if you don't have the room for width and height, see if you have the room for more cores, 3-core, 4-core, etc. Next up on radiators is another thing that really makes a big difference, is they make 2 types of radiators. This is called a cross-flow radiator. So my tanks are on both sides. So the water comes in, comes across the radiator, trickles down, and goes back out. It spends a longer amount of time in the radiator than what's called a downflow radiator. A downflow radiator has the tank on the top, like a lot of old 50s type cars, and so you have a tank, the radiator itself, and another tank, and that water is coming in and trickling down almost like an old Pachinko machine or the game Centipede or something, where it's trying to find its way down. So anytime you can do a cross-flow radiator, they're generally gonna work better. And especially if you can get something that's known as a dual pass radiator, it's actually gonna keep the water in the radiator longer. So not that we want the water in the radiator forever, but the more times it can go back and forth, the more it's dissipating heat. So we want a combination of speed and volume in order to correctly cool the fluids in the radiator. Next up, fans. So we talked a lot about fluid capacity, fluid flow, and cooling characteristics of the actual coolant or water within a radiator system. But we also need to understand another component of that is gonna be flow. A radiator is only gonna be as effective as it can get air across the core. So the more fans we have on our fan blade, the more air we're gonna flow. The larger fan we have, the more air we're gonna flow. The faster the water pump pulley can turn that's actually going to affect the fan if it's mounted to the water pump, and that'll spin faster, right? So there's a few tricks you can do right there. Also, you want to make sure that you don't have any obstructions coming through your grill, because any air obstruction is going to cause air to go up, down, sideways, and not through the radiator. So if you can have clear airflow, the less coolers and such you have strapped to the front, the better the air is going to go through the radiator into the engine bay. In a lot of cases, we just can't get enough airflow, it seems. So a lot of times we'll switch to electric fans. When you go to electric fans, your options are kind of like this. You can put an electric fan up front if you have room, and you can still run a mechanical fan in the back. Make sure it's a pusher fan, because a pusher fan needs to push through. If you can switch to like a dual fan setup or one really large electric fan setup. And again, the more surface area is generally the better. Consider something that has a nice shroud design so that you're pulling air in through all of the radiator instead of just through a specific spot. So anytime you've got an electric fan combo or a mechanical fan combo, a shroud is going to be so key in pulling air through the radiator. And let's also understand something. Not all radiators are created equal. You hear about CFM, which is cubic feet per minute of airflow when you're dealing with radiator, and especially fans. A lot of the companies don't seem to advertise them quite right. There's a couple guys on the internet that are doing some flow tests and really trying to see what flows best and what flows well. But I think the biggest rule of thumb is you kind of get what you pay for. I like a Spall type fan. They're a great company that makes fan motors for a lot of different manufacturers, and almost every time their fans are what they say they're going to be. In terms of other fans, there are tons of other manufacturers on the market. Do your homework and try to understand how well they flow. When you hear the fan running, if you hear a lot of airflow, that probably tells you, it's flowing a lot of air. We just changed a radiator on a GTO, and it was a really nice radiator, and we put in another fan combo, and the second we turned on the fans, you could just hear whoosh. You could just tell it was moving a lot more air. And that's either by motor design, motor power, or blade design. So keep in mind, pushers if they're on the front, pullers on the rear, CFM matters, and also new technology in the game, we've got brushless fans. Brushless fans really move a ton of air. They're just kind of getting popularized on a lot of the newer radiator combinations. So think about a good mechanical, adding an electric fan to complement the system, going to dual electric fans, and getting the most CFM you can, maybe even running a brushless. Another mistake people often suffer while they're trying to keep their engine cool is they're actually preheating different things. So for example, if you're fighting overheating or you're living on the edge of temperatures, you might consider an external cooler for things like oil, transmission fluid, power steering. In this case, this is a tube and fin type transmission cooler, and if I was to install this remote from the radiator, it would allow me to not have tranny fluid going into the radiator cooling and creating additional heat, right? So the transmission's creating heat at about 180 degrees, and that could actually preheat our radiator. To that same end, we might actually overheat our transmission because we have our tranny cooler built into the radiator, and that's actually gonna overheat the transmission. So you might consider a more updated system and put an external cooler in order to fight engine temps and cooling system issues. In addition to this type, a lot of racers and a lot of guys or gals that have room will do a dedicated cooler with its own fan. So just like we talked about doing a radiator with a fan, if you've got room like in a 4x4 or you have a big engine bay, you could actually take this cooler and put it almost anywhere you want and have its own fan. So very important to keep all of your fluids cool, and understanding that it's not just the radiator that needs to be cool. Engine oil, transmission fluid, they also want to be cool. Heat is a killer for any engine, any electronic, and any mechanical part. So anything you can do to keep things cool is worth it. All right, last but not least, a huge mistake is people don't often run a reservoir for their coolant overflow. We want our system to be able to heat up and burp coolant if it wants to, but let's not have a dump on the ground. Obviously that's not good for the environment, but more importantly, it's not good for the cooling system, because if it's burping it out, it leaves the cooling system, winds up on the ground, and over time, every time you lose coolant, you notice your radiator level going lower and lower and lower. So it's highly recommended to have a coolant recovery tank, reservoir, or expansion tank, whatever is going to be appropriate for your vehicle. That allows the radiator to release pressure and allows it to binge and purge. So it'll purge the coolant out into the capture tank, and then later when you're running the car again, if it needs it, it'll actually pull the coolant back in. So it's very important that you're not losing coolant without knowing it. Consider a coolant overflow tank. So hopefully those tips are helpful for you today. Remember, if you want to be in the know, subscribe to my newsletter. I'm going to continue to give free tips like this that are going to help you to keep your car on the road and avoid costly mistakes.